Namaste and good evening, everyone. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste and welcome to everybody.
Today, we are happy to continue on Conscious Reincarnation, Part 3, and we will focus on the third installment of our special theme of how we can carry our current growth of consciousness deliberately in our next life. You may post your questions during our conversation in the chat box, or you may send your questions at email integralstudies.in@gmail.com. We have quite a long letter from Vigneshwar, and I will read his first question. Can we say that the earth chose to respond to Mark's souls by giving it a body and a personality such that it is possible for him to keep the memory of other worlds and use it here? With Mark and other handful of souls like him, is the Earth making a beginning to welcome more souls with extraterrestrial memories for a bigger cosmic purpose?
It's an interesting question and an interesting way of looking at things. Whether Earth is giving the body, whether Earth is making a choice with inviting other souls, unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Yes, there is a role that the Earth consciousness as a whole can play, but in this case, the particular body and personality is rather a choice of the soul from the upper side. From below, it is a question of what the current Earth evolution, that is our planetary and the human biology evolution, can provide as a support. So if in the Earth collective evolution of humanity, there are gradations of biology evolution. I'm being very specific here. That is a biology which is refined versus a biology which is coarse. A biology which allows to inhabit a more intelligent consciousness, a stronger, more powerful vitality, a better health from a genetic progression, from a psycho-spiritual embedding in the tissue substance of the body by the parents, by the heredity, etc. Then the soul can to some extent choose or pick from some of these options. Yes, to that extent the earth provides or can provide a base of support. But from the other side is the soul's choice of where it has and for what it is incarnating. So in this particular case, I had an interesting discussion with Mark, asking him this question about, because I saw his body is extremely strong. The vitality is quite extraordinary even among human types. So I said, in this body you've chosen, in this life incarnation, you've chosen a body of a warrior. And he said, yes, there was a very conscious choice to select the parents, and I think it was, he said, particularly his father, for a certain density of the subtle physical body and a strength of the gross physical body. And for that particular purpose, those parents were chosen. Now you must understand that you don't have much of a choice. If you're focusing on that, you're very likely to find parents who are also somewhat coarse or insensitive, who might just turn out to be abusive, or who might or might not have a sufficient refinement or development of intellect or interest even in those directions. All that is your, so to say, luck and possibilities. From a certain point of view, and there is a position of the soul's perspective high above, where it can even anticipate a time when such a formation is aligning and coincide with an entry of a choice to synchronize with that. So seen from that perspective, one can even say it is preparing, and there's a body being prepared from the Earth's current evolution, and you're synchronizing to incarnate at that point. But still, it's what is available, and you have a lot of baggage that might come with it, which you may or may not find helpful. But having chosen a certain prioritization, you make do with the baggage. So first, it would be wrong to say that the earth consciousness is saying, okay, now I will give him what is useful. No, it's more like he is choosing, but out of the availability. Particularly regarding the question of the choice to keep memory of other worlds and to use that here. It is the soul's choice to remember or to forget. Especially, we have to make the distinction between the more mature and evolved souls versus less conscious, less evolved souls. And that's something which is always difficult to accept. There are souls which are still somewhat immature as a psychic being in terms of their capacity to exercise their will or their influence. They are even, to some extent, one could describe as if half asleep in their psychic development. In such cases, there are beings of the psychic world who will help the soul to incarnate in a domain which naturally aligns with the soul's current evolution or current purpose. When the soul is sufficiently mature, sufficiently awake in its evolution, with an ability to exercise its own independent will sufficiently, then it will say, yes, I want to develop this, I want to grow into this much more. And there it may choose, or again it will be helped, or a combination of both, where it might exercise that choice. In making the choice of the space and purpose, it will also make a choice to retain or erase. It will make a choice of what it draws from past life imprints of personalities. This we read from Sri Aurobindo. It draws what is useful for the content of the experience it wants now, and to bring forward sufficiently what is relevant, but with or without full memory of those things. So in this particular case, at least, again, if we listen to some of Mark's sharings, he says that it's not always in all incarnations that he had the full memory in this way. Nor in this incarnation does he have memory of all incarnations. Some still appear once in a while and in fragments. In some, there's a very strong memory, like what he describes in his book, of the memory that he has of his time in Greece, because that warrior period has been a strong template for this life's incarnation. And so the memories of that are also stronger, and so on. So it's more a choice of the soul. I've shared many times these examples from the mother, where in certain cases where the child had a memory, the mother was very concerned. My teacher, MP Pandit, narrated, and I mentioned this last time, about how a girl born in the family was repeating the verses that his mother used to chant. And mother showed great concern. I remember the gesture he made, the appearance, the face that he had. It was like mother said, "Oh no, that's not very healthy." And there was this very compassionate concern. And then she intervened and the thing stopped. So it is also seen as a carryover, sometimes inadvertently, because a lot of material is carried from the past personality and so on. But always it's a choice in a more evolved soul of what it chooses to bring forward in terms of memory, or to withhold memories of specifics, but just carry the content of its capacity. The second part of the question relates to extraterrestrial beings, and again, is the earth making a beginning to welcome more souls? It's not really a choice that the earth can exercise from a general earth consciousness. It's rather extraterrestrial beings or beings from the earth who may or may not choose to incarnate on different planets. Going back again to fundamentals, the self is always free. The psychic being in its evolution can have relative degrees of ability to exercise that freedom in the details, but the self is always free and can always assert and make a choice. Generally though, the line of development is set, often going across many lives. For this purpose, and there's a plan going across many lives. And more often than not, it would be on a single planet, because that purpose aligns with that planet. For the bulk of us, and I'm making a very broad statement, for the bulk of us who are as if evolving in the earth's substance and human development for a period of many thousands of years, maybe a few million years, we have chosen to do that process of development on this planet. But we are not bound and limited to that choice. One can always say, yes, for purpose of whatever it is, I will incarnate elsewhere and come back. Or not. Or simply say, that's it, I don't want to do this until maybe another few centuries pass and circumstances are better suited. You have complete freedom, fundamentally. But again, at the level of the psychic being and in its evolution, there may or may not be a degree of ability to exercise that freedom, but nevertheless, the freedom, the choice once made, you are also assisted by the beings. So it's not as if Earth is beginning something new. It has always been available. It may be rather that there are many extraterrestrial beings who might say, there's something very interesting happening with the Earth, on the Earth right now. We would like to participate in this, and they may come for this purpose if they feel so inclined. We can go to the next two questions, 2 and 3.
Question number 2. After hearing about Mark's out-of-body adventures and his existences in other planets, I find it very hard to bring back my son's focus on preparing for his 10th board exams, learning maths and many of his immediate priorities in life. Moreover, having told him that this is not a work of fiction has made him partially mad about exploring more. Now, I don't know how much he's willing to give himself to do this, but I can say his mental curiosity has been aroused.
And
Is
I'll say,
there
this is
any
so wonderful.
is there any advice you might have for young children who might like to explore these things without compromising on regular academics? And the third question, focusing on the Brahman, makes us unattached to any world that we might find ourselves to be in. For someone engaged in such a practice of staying focused in the Brahman consciousness, will they still find meaning in exploring and traveling to other worlds? And then we receive another email where he said, please disregard these two questions, with the mention on the second question that I was asked in a lighter vein. Please ignore the part where I mentioned without compromising on regular academics. This is my old habitual self-talking. If you have advice for young minds interested in this, please share. And the third point, it was got answered in the session by Mark, where he says it is consciousness playing hide and seek with itself.
Okay. So, yes, we have disregarded the two questions, but I would still like to comment on something. And it's important because you raised the topic and the point you've made is very much valid. So the question number 2 was about his son in the 10th board exams. In India, the 10th board exams are as if, at least for the parents, a do or die. If you don't do well in the boards, you will not get a good college, you will not get a good opportunity. And then 12th exam, again, it becomes one of those crazy things. Your whole life depends on this one exam. And so the whole year you do nothing else, you think of nothing else, you have no extracurricular activities, you do not play, you do not have fun, just be obsessed with the exam. That's the mentality. I'm sorry to hear that, but that's how it is. I'm sorry to say that. But so there is a certain concern now. The child is crazy about this whole possibility of exploring. I would say even if the child is developing the ability or the interest to explore the universe and especially the spiritual potential, including the out-of-body experiences, and that drives him crazy and it's more interesting than the exams, please do not suppress that. Yes, if you are concerned that the exams need to be done, accept that. Explain to your son that yes, it's needed for other reasons, but this interest that you have, please cultivate, give it time. I would even encourage, take time off from your exam preparations to read about this, enjoy it, and then we go back to the exams with perhaps a fresher mind. But the point is, and coming to this question about children who want to explore these things, yes, it's much better they explore this while they are children. So that right from the early childhood, this orientation of your greater freedom and the possibilities of your experience of the world is emphasized. Because that's the formative stage where the personality is forming, the mind is forming. Make it flexible and open to the deeper spiritual reality of our existence. If you're waiting to have this hard nut formed, rigid, insensitive, materialistic, lost, even misaligned from the soul's aspiration, And then later you say, hey, by the way, wake up and there is a deeper purpose. It's not going to work, or it will be a very hard struggle to undo the damage that the existing educational system has done to you. So I personally think it's a wonderful thing that your son has awakened to this. I wish more children were exposed to this possibility, and even that they're formed with these ideas from early childhood. In my own case, looking back, I had exposure to at least, let's say, regular talks of my teacher, MP Pandit, from a pretty early stage. And I remember at a point when I was still in kindergarten, my mother taking me from the end of the school processes in the evening and still wearing the clothes of the school uniform, going to one of Panditji's lectures and sitting there and listening. I don't know what he spoke, at least I don't remember now what he spoke, but things went in. Something registered at a deeper level, even if the surface mind was not fully understanding in mental terms. The imprint of certain things registered. And I remember at some point, now it's difficult to recall at what age it was, when my mother finally took me to one of these sessions where the meditation was going on in my teacher's house, and I watched people meditating. I saw them closing eyes. I don't remember what I did. Perhaps I also tried. I closed my eyes also. I don't remember. But then when I came back, I exclaimed to my mother. I said, so that means when he talks about going within, you don't have to take your arms and legs inside. See, the thinking was when you go in, and you're identified with the biology, so your biology has to go in. I said, oh, it's kind of a relief to know that you go in, not by taking your arms and legs into you. But obviously, this thought process was already operating. What is this going in? That there's something very important to be done in the going in. There is something within which is very important, and so on. So looking back, I can see how these exposures shaped the overall turn of the personality, the nature, the mind in its formation, the emotions, sense of life purpose, etc. Now, obviously, I found these interesting because something within had already aligned to it. Again, I'll put it in these terms to you. For your own son, he finds this fascinating. He's hooked on it because it resonates with their soul's aspiration. Not all children might find it interesting. Some of them will say, oh, yes, okay, it's a nice work of fiction or imagination. Or maybe even if it's true, yeah, nice, but I would rather go back to my whatever interests them. So I would rather you catch this. You've said his mental curiosity has been aroused. Please nourish it, nurture it, give him more to read, to understand. Put it in a rational context that you can appreciate so that it's not irrational. It does not contradict the developing possibilities of his intelligence. Again, I will refer to my own time. I was at some point teaching in the ashram school to children of the age 10, 11. Somehow that's how it's synchronized. And I would take every opportunity I could to speak of things outside the physical domain and give them certain nudges, suggestions of how they could actually put this into practice in their own life, and as if opening them to the higher possibility. I remember once we did something quite unusual. It was very, very hot. It was the middle of summer. It had got so hot that everybody was struggling. There was no rain. And the children were speaking about it. They said, oh, we had heard that mother did this and they trained and something. So I explained to them how this works. How I narrated the stories of how mother would ask Sri Aurobindo to prevent rain or to call rain. And then later when people, I remember this incident from Karnataka where in response to somebody's plea, the mother had the rains. And within a week, the same person sent back strong telegram saying, please mother, there's too much rain, we're having floods, please stop the rain. And mother's simple comment was ungrateful humanity. They could not say thank you for the rain, which they had asked for and was granted. It was always about, give us what we don't have, now stop, this is too much, oh, we don't want. There was never a thanks. You see, and that is the nature of the unfortunate humanity. So anyway, giving all these, then I taught them the mantra that the mother gave. I narrated stories of how students from our school had caused rain and stopped rain and things like that. So I taught them the mantra. And on one occasion, they said, okay, we want to chant. I said, great, let's do it. And I showed them how to concentrate on the purpose, and then we all chanted together. Obviously, it did not rain immediately, but within 48 hours, there was huge torrential rain. And I don't know to what extent they registered that it was very likely because of the call that they had. So, just to give you an example of early on, orient the mind's, heart's sense of life purpose, sense of identity to the spiritual perspective of life. And as a result, everything changes. So, one of the things, again, I'll share here, children have often asked, and this is something common, they'll say, oh, tell us a ghost story. Now, I try to understand where this is coming from, and what I understood was the sense of excitement, tension, novelty, the paranormal, even a sense of controlled, protected space where you can experience fear and learn to relate to it. So once in a while, I will say, okay. And what was interesting, the children would jump with joy, close the windows, and dim the lights so that they could have a scary experience. All of them, no exception. Occasionally, there'll be one child who would say, I'm really scared. And I would tell the child, don't worry, you won't get scared. It'll be a fun story. And then I would narrate 1, 2, 3 stories. Each time, they were on no fake stories, no made up stories. Because with cinema, you make up stories, these are very deceptive. Always they were true stories. They were interesting. Sometimes they were scary in a controlled way. And I would ensure the tension of the fear would be there, and then just enough. And then I would explain why it happens, how it happens, what it means, and why you should never fear. There's no reason to fear. What you should do if ever you feel fear about anything, even if without any reason. So it became an educative process about the deeper and other realities, which they will experience at some point in life, or which already they sense intuitively and want to know about. So I would say, young people, engage with their interest, arouse their mental curiosity, even give them means. And I remember at the time, because I'd heard all these things, I knew what it meant to put into practice the spiritual life, but also some of these, let's say, more occult directions of development, including telepathy, empathy, ability to influence circumstances, all these things, the background of it, the understanding of it was always important. And so one of the things I remember now, which happened to me spontaneously at the age of 10, 11, when I was in the, maybe a year before, about 9, 10. We used to have the class music, the school music right at the beginning, 5 minutes, something of Sunil's music or mother's music would be played, mostly Sunil. We all sat, eyes closed, concentrate, meditate, whatever the term was used, and then open. So mostly we're daydreaming. And one day, being quite bored, it's okay, it's a relaxing thing. Being quite bored, I said, hey, what about this? And I remembered I had heard my teacher speaking of the ability to silence the thoughts. So children don't even know it's possible. But I'd heard it so many times, I said, well, I should be able to do this. Let me do it. And I began to practice that. And it was so much fun for the next few days, weeks. Every time we were doing that concentration, I would work to silence the thought and hold the state of silence. It came spontaneously, but because I'd heard that it's possible, I'd heard the benefits of it, and so I wanted to. Nowhere in current education are we teaching these things to our children. And if you're going to wait for them to become hardened adults, rigid and limited and narrow and materialistically bound, and then you say, hey, you have to do this, it's difficult. Catch them young, start early. So this is what I would give as advice. And do not worry, it will not compromise regular academics. On the other hand, it will even amplify. Because you have to also put some of these insights in context of the academics. Teach them that there's such a thing as intuition, that sometimes you don't know what the answer is. You can become very quiet and deep inside you. Either you have the memory or you'll have the intuition that you can draw on. So you'll give them the means from this deeper perspective to excel even in their academics, or the value of the academics will be understood in those terms. So this is as regards your second question. Yes, I did disregard your concern about it, but the question itself is very valid. And even the third question, where you say someone who's engaged, focused on the Brahman, to make us unattached to any world that we find ourselves in. That is, I'm quoting from you. Would you, if staying in Brahman consciousness, will they still find meaning in exploring and traveling to other worlds? Now, by your question itself, there is a presumption that to focus on Brahman is to focus on Brahman away from the world. Is that true? Is Brahman away from the world? Think about it. So this is the common idea in the ascetic spirituality, that the divine is away from the world. World is not God. World is illusion. To focus on Brahman is reality against world, which is illusion. But this is a wrong idea. World is an intimate part of Brahman, in the very definition of Brahman, which is the one that is the all. And so the world is a very much part of it, and it is not illusory. Perhaps our perception of it is somewhat illusory or clouded in illusion, but it is very real at body of Sachidananda. At least this is the perspective of the Veda and of the integral yoga. In such a case, to dwell on Brahman ideally should include the world. Or perhaps you may say, fine, I want to dwell upon Brahman in the essentiality transcending space-time form. But then you're making a choice to dwell on that. Even if you do that, the purpose in exploring and traveling to other worlds would be relevant, because in that state, out of body, even those experiences can be had more intensely, more completely, more profoundly. Put it in other terms, if you look at what we have discussed earlier in the whole series we had on outer body experiences and dreams, etc. So in that theme, we had discussed how when you go out of the body, even what you might do in meditation state, in the out of body state, is enormously more powerful and complete, but also you have access to be able to shift gradations into higher worlds, which you can do in a meditative state while in the body, so to say, shift your levels of consciousness. But when out of the body, each of those levels would correspond to entire experiences of worlds. And so, yes, from a purely spiritual perspective, whether focused on Brahman that includes world or the part of Brahman which is outside space-time form, yes, these would still be relevant. And remember, after all this has been said, who is it that chose that I want Brahman outside world? This outer personality. Based on what? Because you were told that this is the better thing to do. Yet when you come out of that concentration and something within you says, hey, I need to do something with my life, those are other parts of you which you have learned to suppress. In the context of the integral yoga, this would not be the case. You would have the Brahman not only in its transcendence, you would have the divine presence in immanence, and you would also have the divine presence in expression. And you would want to manifest. So there, certainly the ability to explore higher worlds in an outer body state would be relevant. Not essential, but could be helpful if you had it. But again, it's important, not essential for the spiritual purpose. Certainly a great help when you have it. So I think this also clarifies. There's the fourth question we can go to now.
He also got that point that where Mark says that the consciousness is playing hide and seek.
Yes.
Do you want to comment on that?
Yes. So obviously, if we are that, and we have entered into this as a play of the hide and seek. What is interesting about this phrase Mark used about consciousness playing hide and seek with itself is that it is an exact repeat of what Sri Aurobindo said and what the Veda has said. But he's not saying it from having read anything. He's saying it from his living experience of what essential reality is, from his own exploration in the out-of-body state, in the higher worlds, etc. And you recognize, especially in the higher worlds, it is obvious. There is only consciousness. All is consciousness. When you read the book, he mentions this in one of the chapters. But you notice from there how consciousness forms veils, so to say, hiding from itself as if to create for the purpose of the play, self-limiting, etc. So there's a vocabulary which Sri Aurobindo uses with great precision. Mark is struggling to find the words to articulate, but when he finds the words, he comes to some very similar words. And this is one of the things which I so value and appreciate in Mark's expressions of his experiences, that there is a great clarity, precision, and intuitive insight through and in these experiences, which is like the touch of truth. Sometimes, especially when he will speak in English, he's struggling to find the right words. In French, he is much more fluid. But for those of you who attended his talk this time in English, he's getting there where it will be as good as the French. But yes, this play of hide and seek with itself is coming from him, totally independent of all these where you find exactly the same idea in the Veda and in Sri Aurobindo's writings. We go to the fourth question.
And the fourth question, one extended question is I have about the information ball that Marx talks about. This is very interesting. From the light body point of view, I can guess that's the truth. Could you please share your opinion too?
This vocabulary of Mark, also light body, and then he calls the swamp region, and then the Z epsilon matter, etc. They're his vocabulary, and they correspond to, in Sri Aurobindo's vocabulary, something to do with, so epsilon matter is the subtle physical and the lower vital ranges. The swamp is the lower vital and subtle physical, where desire is the primary driver and substance itself is infused, is desire, as distinct from the higher vital, which opens to the mental, which is what I understand he refers to as the light body, in which then you have the clear freedom from the desire, you're out of the swamp. But one of the things he describes, and it's not limited to just the light body, it is also possible on other planes. Even it's possible in the physical world, but the biology is much too dulled to be able to do that more easily. But especially in the higher vital and mental worlds, he describes how you can actually gather a certain content of experience and knowledge, and then as if throw it, gift it, flow it, project it to somebody else, who then receives it, and as that integrates, you as if live that experience. It's as if you have lived it, now it's a part of you. And that's how you transmit knowledge or experience. It's the only way to have true transmission of knowledge. What we have to do with our present mind in the biology is, my experience has to translate into words. The words transfer to you. In your mind, you interpret the words and try to recreate the experience which I am having. Obviously, there are large gaps in my transmission, in your reception, and misalignments, misunderstandings are so common. The moment you move out sufficiently, and especially when the consciousness is more free, what you convey, you can still use words, but what you convey in the words itself is the substantiality of the experience, which imprints into the other as if their own experience and is absorbed as if you have lived it. In identity, knowledge in identity is the natural transmission, is the natural way of knowing, and so on, and is therefore a much more rapid way of learning things or even of evolving, even spiritually. So again, putting it into context, physically, you're sitting in concentration, you receive this descent. Oh, what an experience beyond your imagination. And you try to grip it, hold it, and then it tends to fade out. You're coming back into dull matter. The same thing happens there. Oh, what an experience. But in the substance of the subtle body, especially in the higher layers, you can hold it easily, fully, freely. When you come back to the physical body, again, there is the dulling and the losing. So at the end of the day, you're struggling with the integration with the physical body, physical mind, generally physical consciousness in any case. But essentially, all knowledge is received or transmitted essentially only by means of identity. And to the extent that in the physical body we have grown enough in those levels, we are able to transmit or receive. And you'll all have had this experience sometimes when you're reading something from Sri Aurobindo. As you read, because you are in a certain receptive state, as you read, the truth of the experience as if fills you, and even as if you're pulled into the experience. Or sometimes when somebody narrates who lives the experience that they narrate, sometimes you feel as if, yes, I feel as if I have lived it, as if I've experienced it in some part of me, in the more receptive layers. So this is happening on all planes. It's just that on the higher planes, it is much more direct, spontaneous, effortless, and the normal way of communicating. So this was important. I would like to put in context why these questions are coming up, although they don't directly relate to the reincarnation topic. In fact, they do, but in a secondary way. This communication of the information ball that the vocabulary Mark uses, he explained that sometimes what may come to you as a past life memory may not be yours. He made a whole discussion in the talk we had last Sunday about various forms of false past memory. And this is one of those where, for example, he said, As you're about to incarnate, you ask somebody who belongs to the Earth evolution or who's more experienced in Earth evolution, hey, what's this like? What do I need to know about this planet or this human species experience? And the person can gather a bundle of experience and project it. And it may come to you because it's drawn from their life experience. It may be projected into you. And because you experience it as yours, when you incarnate, you may even remember this as if you have lived this in your past life, except it's not your past life, it's their past life. Or it's their constructed life experience from whatever means or source which they've projected, and it's not really your past life. Or an equivalent can happen even, and it often happens under hypnosis, where you tap into some floating imprints of memories and identify with it, and you say, it's mine. No, it's not. And so you have to develop a certain intuitive discrimination to separate what is such captured or projected memories versus your real memories. So this was the context of this information ball. We can go to
Krishna,
the next
we have got two questions. The first, what I've understood is through various personality molds, the souls evolve across several lifetimes. It's also possible to evolve in the same lifetime by taking on different personality molds. Is it also possible to modify the Svadharma in the same lifetime?
Okay. So yes, we have different molds across several lifetimes because the soul wants to have a different kind of experience. So we have been reading Sri Aurobindo and discussing this. His question, is it possible to evolve in the same lifetime taking on different personality molds? And is it possible to modify your Swadharma, your essential sense of purpose in the same lifetime? So it's interesting. The normal response that mother gives to questions of this kind, she says, each case is unique, or as many cases there are, would be different, infinite possibility, because it's based on infinite freedom. So in principle, you could say yes. But coming to the practical side of it, understanding the process, it's not common or it's not easy. So certainly it's possible to change your mold multiple times in this lifetime. Ideally, if your mold itself is more plastic, you're able to shape the mold as needed as you evolve, as you grow, to make it responsive to your current need. Consider that at a certain stage in your childhood, you had a particular mold for that purpose. What if you say, now I'm going to freeze myself to what I am when I'm 12 years old? Obviously not. Because when you're 14, when you're 18, when you're 25, you are completely different. Your priorities, interests, needs of evolution are totally different. Where does this hardening happen? So we are told biologically from age 25 onwards, the brain starts hardening. And I've always asked myself, this is an observation of scientists. An observation because most people by that age stop trying to grow. Would it be the same case for those who are actively continuing to learn new things beyond 25? And I believe that is not the case for all, that it's not hardened. You can push it further. It's just that it becomes less and less biology driven or instinct driven. See, the bulk of humanity is growing by instinct and the drive of biology. The instinct and drive of biology decides when your body grows, decides when it stops, decides when your brain starts becoming less plastic, etc. But if the mind at that point wills it and chooses to push the boundary, the biology will follow. With some resistance perhaps, but it will follow. And if you persist in this, you're embedding in the species consciousness this further plastifying or this potential. And that's how the collective consciousness and the biology consciousness of a species evolves, by the sustained effort of individuals in the species consciousness. But that being the case, there is no potential in principle limit to the plasticity you can have in all the layers. Obviously, our mind is most plastic, vital less plastic, biology least plastic. I've shared examples before of how the mother's biology was plastic enough that even the physical shape could change depending on what particular quality of consciousness she was embodying. So I don't repeat those examples. You have heard them before. If not, go back and listen to those. These are fascinating. But this is the case also with people who have worked on the body consciousness to make it plastic. And so, yes, ideally, you would have a constantly reshaping mold of your temperament and nature. But I'm coming to something more important in the question where he says, is it possible to modify your swadharma in the same lifetime? So, again, in principle, yes, but what do you mean by swadharma? Swadharma is the sense of purpose, the innate truth of this life's incarnation. Swabhava is the temperament, nature of this incarnation, let's say. The Swabhava, temperament, nature, can be molded. That's what we were talking about so far. Swadharma is the sense of purpose. So I'm going to say, normally not, although the soul is free. In its freedom, it has chosen a sense of purpose in this lifetime. So broadly, it will not change. But what it may do is it may widen or narrow the scope as required by circumstances. Yes, one can play with some variations of details, but the broad sense of purpose is decided with a very specific prioritization which tends to drive. But can it? Yes, in principle. Will it? Probably not, because it's already chosen from a certain viewpoint where these minor things are taken care of, or let's say the broad things are taken care of and only minor variations are relevant or not. We go to the second question.
When a person gets involved in a fatal accident and the soul is thrown out of the body, is this because the soul unconsciously chooses to put itself in such a circumstance because of the lack of plasticity in the personality, or because it was just a coincidence?
So the case of fatal accidents where the soul is thrown out of the body, you have to understand there are two kinds. There are those where, as you have suggested in the question itself, the soul might choose to use the accident as a way for a quick exit, where it finds the personality unable to grow, it's too rigid, too bound, too suffocating, or it's fulfilled whatever it could to the maximum that it could and wants to change. Yes, that can happen. But there are also genuine accidents where the soul is not ready to go, and by an unfortunate set of circumstances is kicked out, so to say. More often than not, the accidents of this kind would be also caused by active forces that want to harm the evolution. And then there are less often circumstances which you could call coincidence, where you're part of a collective which is in danger, and you are as if carried by the force of the collective lack of protection. A lot depends also on your consciousness. If you're conscious in your aspiration, if there is within you the link to the divine presence, there will be also some kind of a protection present for you. But you could be bound in a group where the protection is weakened because of the nature of what you're surrounded with. Or the reverse could happen. Because you have the protection, the group might benefit from it and would be miraculously saved despite the accident. Either way, there can be a situation where you get sucked into a certain circumstance where despite yourself, you are, so to say, thrown out of the body. In which case, the soul will simply want to reincarnate as quickly as possible to continue the part of the life, the experience which it could not complete. So, I think that answers your question. We can go to the next question, which is quite long.
From Pratik. I have been following your new series on conscious reincarnation with interest, but I'm sorry to say that I'm finding it to be simplistic, full of contradictions, and glossing over important questions. You are mostly dealing with easy, feel-good topics like I'm a poet in this life and I'll be a painter in the next, in commas. You're not tackling the reality hard problems. You said there is no need for suffering in our lives, and that any existing suffering should be used as a tool for growth. You also said the only point of our suffering is growth, and that the spirit inside us is completely free, even free to choose suffering. This rose-tinted view does not explain why everyday thousands or millions of people undergo intense physical violence, torture, and death. What could then possibly grow into during the time of indescribable pain, only then to die soon after from their injury or in trauma? They may not even regain consciousness, and if they do briefly gain consciousness, wondering how they might grow wouldn't be their top priority at that point. Where is the opportunity for growth here? Aren't such situations just tortures by higher forces simply because they have the power? Isn't our suffering food for entities? Don't they farm us for our energy like we farm fish and chicken for their flesh? You yourself said the soul is indifferent to our suffering and may even enjoy the suffering as an experience, like we enjoy watching a movie. Except we always have a choice of painlessly walking out of the movie theater. In physical reality, we don't. And comparing the widespread and intense suffering of this prison planet with watching movie for fun, it's trivializing and normalizing it. There is nothing normal about it. You quote Sri Aurobindo's commentary on Isha Upanishad, where he says we suffer because we are small in our consciousness and we are cut off from the whole. Perhaps we should remind all the Hindus being raped and butchered in Bangladesh of this and tell them growing consciousness or suffer. Oh, did you know you choose this suffering? So stop whining, will you? This is in comas. And then wash your hands off it. I mean, they are small in consciousness, so of course they'll suffer. No amount of action will change that, right? You quote Sri Aurobindo where he says, if teaching lessons was the objective, then erasing memory would be a grave injustice. Indeed, but what if teaching lessons was never the objective? What if the only goal is breeding us here on this realm like cattle, whipping our memory after death and recycling us back in here to harvest our energies for yet another lifetime through yet more pain, more suffering, and trauma?
It's a long question, somewhat provocative in the way it is articulated. But I've kept the whole thing as it is because I think we need to face this line of thinking also. And there are many important points which are being raised. So, first of all, to Pratik's general initial comment, oh, it's too simplistic, full of contradictions and glosses important questions. No, that's not true. There are no contradictions anywhere, even with what you're saying. Certainly, there is always a prioritization. In the earlier discussions, I've always prioritized the freedom of the self to choose. Freedom of choice was important because we were trying to separate from the conventional religious ideas that we are bound, we are trapped, and we have no freedom. And therefore, the perhaps exaggerated emphasis on the sense of freedom. But there's no contradiction at all here, nor are any of the important questions glossed out. So I'll touch upon some of the key points you make. You said that, so you're quoting that the soul is free to choose and even to choose life where there's suffering. From the point of view of the soul, it doesn't have to have the same value as your surface personality. But it's not a rose-tinted view. This is the reality of the soul. In much of your question, you are confusing between the soul perspective and the human surface personality perspective. The human surface personality will suffer, may not suffer too much. From the soul's point of view, none of that is valid. The soul's suffering is only when, and soul, I would say the psychic being, suffering only when it feels itself trapped in the surface personality and unable to grow in the way it wants to grow. That too, if it has a very clear, distinct will of growing in a certain way. In many cases, as I mentioned earlier, the psychic being is not too evolved and simply is, so to say, allowing the flow of events to build the kind of experience which would be useful for its development and growth, and it's learning to exercise its will or its influence. And so the individualization within of the psychic influence is not very strong. So in such a case, it's just saying, oh, or just getting some nourishment or not. But there's nothing rose tinted. This is how it is from the inner point of view. But there is, on the other side, what you're describing every day, thousands or millions undergo intense physical violence, torture, and then death. I suspect that in the way you're articulating, it seems to be a bit of an exaggeration. I would not say millions are undergoing intense torture and death, at least not today. Yes, maybe thousands, and specific to specific locations. If you look at general condition, let's say just take India, and India as it is today, in the larger part, in 95% of India, there are no wars. Largely, you have stable food, physical comfort. Everybody has a shower today, a toilet, pretty much everybody. Which, if you go back even 100 years, was a luxury, to have a shower in your home. When you have to go to the river or have a well, even to take a bath, to take a shower. It's a luxury. Compared to what we were 100 years ago, largely today, you would say we are living in extremely improved levels of comfort. With the exception of spaces where there are these violent, occasional attacks, which you see in the terrorism, or as in Bangladesh, where there is a religious violence, and except for that, even in Bangladesh, if you go back 10 years, that was not the case. It was held in check by the former rulers. Now suddenly an extremist ideology takes over, extremist Islamic ideology, and wants to kill because it believes that's the right thing to do for reward in heaven. That's again a new thing. It was not so. It was perhaps held in check, but nevertheless, it's a new thing. And maybe thousands are suffering, but you can't say millions. Yes, there have been millions who were butchered in Africa recently. Going back, I think it was in Sudan, there was the war between two tribes, and millions being armed from the West, butchering each other to reduce population so that those big multinationals can come up, buy the land and start the mining, which is their long-term goal. Yes, all this is also happening. But if you look at the totality of humanity, out of whatever 6+ billion, that's a few millions. Again, in proportion, humanity as a whole is far better off. And the physical torture, violence, death, etc. are still in small pockets. You might still say during the Second World War that was, but that's a specific case of war. So it's not as if the soul is coming to incarnate and being suddenly sucked into this everywhere. No, that's not the case. That's an exaggeration. But yes, it does happen that when it has come to incarnate and there is a war that has begun, it finds itself caught. When the Ukraine war started, for example, quite a few people were caught unaware, unexpectedly. And then there's a chain of events. Many tried to escape, etc. But those who got caught, they sucked, they died. It's not as if they died with the same suffering for the last 50 years. It's a recent thing, a phenomenon which lasted a few years. And largely it was triggered by human stupidity of the rulers that perhaps they voted for. So again, if you look at the circumstances there, the group that chose, again you go back to Palestine, which elected Hamas, which then started this whole pointless destruction of its own people, which spent the billions of dollars which they could have put for education to building underground tunnels for killing the Israelis and for storing bombs and destroying. Not interested in their own people, because the whole ideology was otherworldly and so on. So, but they elected it, isn't it? So there is a complex situation where you are part of a cycle which comes from ignorance, stupidity, indoctrination, etc., in which the trauma is, so to say, self-created. You may not always see the connection there. You take the example of suffering in Bangladesh, and you say the Hindus who are being killed. It's not as if the Hindus were caused that. Yes, they are victims because they had nothing to do with it. We see, for example, the Bangladeshi government took the leader of the ISKCON movement, put him in jail, harassed him no end, etc. But There's no rational except extremist ideology. Yes, but still, the numbers relatively are smaller. I'm not justifying it. I'm just showing that what you say millions all the time, every day, no, it's no more the case. Maybe it might have been when humanity was maybe in a certain stage of evolution. I don't know. But the question still remains, what is the point from the soul's point of view? Obviously, from a soul's point of view, if you are just born, you suffer and die in a very short cycle, it's pointless. The soul came for a certain purpose. If it got sucked into the war and got killed in a traumatic way, that was not obviously useful. But it can happen that, and I would put it this way to the Hindus in Bangladesh who are being killed in this way, that yes, they didn't ask for it, they didn't deserve it, they are suffering. Some of them have been killed in the most horrific way. The soul is traumatized. So there are two options there. The soul in that trauma may undergo a transitional phase of sustained trauma before it can get free of it and then reincarnate. Or emerging, it may simply say, oh, this was horrible, I need to move on and continue the work for which I came and incarnate. So there are many possibilities. Still, I'm highlighting the fact of the soul's freedom ultimately, despite the trauma and even the transfer of trauma in the otherworldly afterworld passage. So what I would disagree with you is in maybe it's a vocabulary issue where you say, where is the opportunity for growth here? Yes, I agree. There's not much opportunity. It's quite a wasted life when such a thing happens. And yes, there are powers which want to destroy human evolution, which want to harm. So aren't such situations, you say, just tortures by higher forces simply because they have the power? Yes, but I would not call them higher forces. I would call them lower forces. They are anti-divine, anti-evolutionary forces. They are more powerful. So if by higher you mean more powerful, yes, certainly. But they are not higher in gradation of consciousness. They are harmful. They are intentionally creating distress. But they are not the only ones. There are equally the diviner forces who are preventing this or trying to prevent it. And in the balance, the diviner forces have greater power in the long term, which is why you see the sustained evolution even in terms of purely material comforts in humanity. But there's a point of choice among human beings. Which one do they align to? And often that causes the consequence that they will suffer. I'm going to give an example here very specifically. In the ashram, at a certain stage, when the supramental consciousness was intensely on the brink of manifestation, 1937, 38 particularly, if I remember right, and it seemed to be imminent, the World War was begun, and Mother said even in some way it was done to distract their attention to protect humanity so that this could not be done. But there's a very interesting letter of Sri Aurobindo. He said regarding certain tendencies among people to bring in certain kinds of coarse sexual energies. He said if that is allowed in that space of the ashram, if that is allowed, it would attract the lower vital forces and give them an entry into this space, this bubble of concentrated intense sadhana, and would allow them entry to create chaos and harm the work. So I'm going to take this and build upon it a little bit. Look at the large numbers of young people turning to crude, coarse drugs and orgy type experiences in nightclubs. Maybe not all are as coarse, but still nevertheless, those spaces are largely deliberately invoking opening to lower vital forces. These people, while they are in that state of inebriation, intoxication with alcohol and drugs and instinctive impulsive sex, they are opening themselves to lower vital forces, allowing their bodies to be hooked by those forces and giving the forces a place to incarnate on earth. This is a phrase Sri Aurobindo uses, that it's as if the lower vital worlds are pressing down and trying to hook into humanity. This was during the Second World War, just before the Second World War. And wherever the human beings allow that, what do you think will happen next? Wherever these lower vital forces come and get their hook, they will create the chaos that you have given them access to. in the spaces you have given them access to. And there will be consequences to that. I was quite surprised to see, even during the Ukraine war, once the war had started, within a few months, there were these American singers going there and having these programs which actually showed you the scope of the war. In Kiev, they were having these at night, these programs of large major dances and some of that music. And they had nightclubs underground which were going on in their routine freely, as if the war didn't exist. And you'd have to ask yourself, the people who are involved in the war itself, participating and opening to these forces, what do you think will be consequences? Do you think in that state of inebriation or coming out of it the next day, they would be open to higher intuition or a light that would give them the knowledge to be able to undo, to reverse, or even to break out of this trend line of self-destruction? Obviously not, because they've hooked into the very opposite vibrations. So in that sense, and I'm putting it in a very general way on a broad scope, the collectives in humanity where you see these extreme forms of war are actually the consequences of things they've been doing, wallowing in, or grades of consciousness they've been living in or inviting. Now, what most people don't know is that in large parts of Africa to this day, there is a lot of low-grade black magic, meaning deliberate invocation to lower-level vital forces. This is present in some of the most developed countries, economically and modern development, where you have the big buildings and all the usual amenities of a developed country. The political class and even the business classes are actively involved in low-grade invocation of vital beings for benefit, for power, for wealth, for destroying their enemies, etc. So it's a space where there's a very strong engagement of lower vital forces in the public life, but also in the political battles and business battles. And then the moment you create that in a collective, in a strong way, and those forces hook in, they are forces of chaos, and there will be consequences of increasing chaos. And it's done with very low grade magic. A lot of this came to the United States initially with some of the transport of the slaves who brought in these low-grade witchcraft into what you see today in Haiti and in some of these regions, and brought it with them, which are still held and put in practice by these groups. So recently there was a controversy about some of these groups coming and stealing pets from people's houses and then using them for ritual sacrifice for low-grade magic and things like that. And there's a comment which Trump had made and then Elon Musk had made about this. And the mainstream media tried to ridicule it. But the reality is, yes, this thing is happening. And many of the immigrants who come from this background and bring with them some of this very low-grade magic. Now, Sri Aurobindo makes this comment regarding India, going back about in 1929, I believe, in one of Pavitra Das' conversations with Sri Aurobindo, where he shows him pictures of people who have been doing mediumship and materializations in Europe as a part of what they called scientific exploration of psychic phenomena. And Sri Aurobindo says this is tapping into very low-grade vital beings. And these are all beings of chaos and destruction. And he says, if in India this is done in a large scale, it would completely destroy the spiritual potential of the country. And then he says, because the Indian temperament is very finely balanced between the inner and outer worlds. And if you opened it to this kind of coarse, low-grade vibration, it would completely damage. And then he says, but the European consciousness being much more coarse about inner things, the damage is far less. It's a very interesting observation. But the consequences of that are what you see in what happened in the Second World War, for example. How many people are aware that the Second World War was primarily an occult battle? Yes, we have heard Sri Aurobindo's and the Mother's action on the occult level. But how many are aware that actually the Nazi elite core was deep into these, what we would today call black magic practices, opening to lower vital beings, invoking, incarnating, embedding them as part of their ritual means for power control or whatever it was the goal. Hitler was one of the most effective mediums. I've mentioned this in one of those talks which we had on the theme of current affairs in the early ones, where I tried to show what happened with the Nazi energy and how it embedded in the United States in the CIA. But the point was, I forget the name Hitler was part of this occult group. I forget the name of the head of that. And the head of that is on record saying that Hitler is one of the most powerful mediums and would play a significant role in the future. This was in the early 1920s. And as a medium for the Asuric forces, well, what is the result? Obviously chaos, confusion, destruction. So the point I'm coming to, wherever you see this extreme widespread suffering, etc., is an action of these forces, but because human beings gave them full access. So at the end of the day, we still have to recognize we as a humanity have a choice. As a collective, we are still suffering the consequences of our current, let's say, average or the local average consciousness and the opening that we have to it, to the forces which align to what it is we are working for. If just now the bulk of humanity, let's say, turned consciously to the spiritual, most of these problems, just like that, overnight would fizzle out. And that's why it is so important from the beginning to consciously awaken in the young people the aspiration for the spiritual and the sensitivity for the spiritual, and to warn them about the dangers of opening to lower forces in the name of whatever it is. What you find in the New Age chaos and confusion of teaching is the very opposite. They will call the drugs as spiritual experiences. They will call the plants as spiritual drugs or spiritual whatever. They're not spiritual. They are lower vital. And if you fool yourself and go into that, the consequences for you would be terrible. Mark repeatedly speaks of this because he sees that. He sees the consequence among people who take drugs and the gashes, the cuts, the breaks that it creates in your natural protection from the lower vital entities. And then when you go out of the body, either at the time of death or in an out-of-body experience, the zones that you plug into because of that exposure that you've had and the damage that it does in your spiritual evolution. So he will give you explicit descriptions of why it is harmful, and he constantly reminds people, if you're doing it, stop immediately, get rid of it. It has nothing to do with spirituality. But how many would bother to listen when so much of the New Age junk is telling you do that, that's your way to spiritual experience? I have mentioned even in a spiritual gathering, people said, oh, but with drugs, we are getting the same experience as you people who are doing all this fancy meditation. We're getting it immediately. You take years. And actually, one of the speakers there said, oh, but that is cheating. In effect, accepting that the experiences were equivalent. No, they're not. They're fundamentally different. But even the spiritual people who had experience of the drugs did not have enough understanding of how much harm it did or does to them or even to the existing people. So I'm perhaps digressing a little bit in highlighting all this, but to show again that we are not a prison planet. So this phrase I disagree with. We are not a prison planet. We are a humanity which is in transition, in evolution from a very crude, let's say, phase of animal consciousness into a higher spiritual potential. And the large parts which are choosing to stay stuck with the animal consciousness are facing consequences. And increasingly, as the evolutionary pressure builds, the consequences will become more painful. But still, it is a choice to align to the lower instead of the higher. And then the suffering, which comes as a consequence, even collective. But from the big picture point of view, if you look at the suffering which was, let's just take Europe during the time when the Christian church was suppressing all knowledge. It held people in darkness for centuries. And the overthrow of that and the awakening into reason, and then even an attempt to now outgrow religion into spirituality. All these are very clear positive trends. at least among those, even in a large group, but among those who are on the cutting edge of it, it's an awakening. It's not prison planet. This idea I have read about in certain kinds of literature where they will say, yes, there are overlords who dominate the planet and keep you as a prison. Yeah, the truth of it is there are these asuric beings. They don't control, they don't rule. If political powers align to those, still I will say they don't rule the planet. They control, influence those who submit to them. And even if in your country your political elite is aligned to that, you as a people have the freedom now to break away, and with that then elect anew and bring about a change. In my understanding at least, and I've said this in those discussions on current affairs, this was a radical shift that took place in India in 2014 when Narendra Modi came to power as Prime Minister. A similar radical shift has taken place now in the United States when Donald Trump has come to power a second time with a larger collective awakening. And with that, you see the rapidity of changes taking place even as he's cleaning house, eliminating all the compromise and the destructive tendencies which had entrenched themselves. It's not going to be easy. We have to pay the price for the damage done before, but it's happening. So everything to me points to a very different picture. And to put the entire planet in the context of prison, I would disagree entirely. And I'm not trivializing anything here when I say this. So when you say watching it as a movie for fun is trivializing, I had put that in a context of an individual life. I used the analogy of a cinema where, the soul says, wow, what an experience. And even in times of war, where you are fighting for life and death, you don't know if you'll survive the next day. You don't know if a bomb will fall. From the soul's point of view, it is what an occasion, what an opportunity to face this hostile uncertainty and come through and triumph. That's the soul's perspective always, despite external appearances of suffering. So this is what we had read last time from Sri Aurobindo Savitri. When you are putting the context of all Hindus being raped and butchered in Bangladesh to go and tell them grow in consciousness or suffer and stop whining, will ya, you are trivializing this knowledge, this perspective. It's a mistake you are making. You say, yes, I mean they are small in consciousness, so of course they will suffer. No, that's not the perspective. The suffering we are speaking of is not suffering purely from war. We are speaking of a general suffering of human existence, which is the consequence of being in a consciousness which is small. So, why is it that you are dissatisfied with your life? Why is it that you suffer in the midst of all this comfort and you are unhappy? Why is it that you find every effort that you make to improve your life a struggle? It's on that scale that we were describing that this is the consequence of your consciousness being narrow, cut off from the whole. We were not speaking of war and destruction, which is of a different grade altogether, where it's not your individual consciousness, but a collective circumstance of which you are then a victim. So, again, when you say no amount of action will change that, right? You are trivializing the matter. I've always said, and this is very clearly stated in the affirmative spirituality by Sri Aurobindo in the Veda, that we are here to act, to change circumstances. And by action, you will change circumstances. So I don't know where you get this idea that we are victim. You're mixing a lot of the junk that comes from the ascetic, life-rejecting, life-denying and illusory philosophies which say you can't do anything, you are trapped, and you're mixing that with what we are communicating here. I have explicitly tried to separate the two, but still something in your mind is blending the two things. So just be clear, we are not speaking of being victims, we are not speaking of being helpless. That is what is taught in the traditional Abrahamic teachings, where it's God's will, you have to suffer, the more you suffer, the more you'll be rewarded, and all that kind of junk. Or in the illusory traditions of the Mayavada in India, where all this is illusion, you are suffering because you are incarnating endlessly, helplessly, until you break out. That's not at all our position. Our position is one of freedom, essentially. And when you act from freedom, you're able to overcome your circumstances. So act. But act from a deeper insight, not in a knee-jerk reaction, which can be only worsening the circumstances. You're also coming to this speculation, and I'm clearly stating that you're speculating when you say, what if teaching lessons was never the objective? I don't think it's a question of lessons. You've misunderstood that. This, again, it's a mentality which is coming from the Abrahamic tradition, which says, oh, God is teaching you a lesson. So you are here to learn lessons which God is imposing. Not at all. The Vedic perspective, Sri Aurobindo's perspective, is totally different. We are here from a joy to learn and grow. It's not as if a lesson is being imposed from outside. We are exploring. And that's why the video game analogy is superior to the lesson analogy. The lesson analogy is, okay, your teacher now with a stick tells you, learn or I'll whack you, I'll punish you or I'll reward you. And only you'll progress to the next if you pass this lesson. That's stupid. That's wrong. The video game analogy is superior, where you are saying, hey, what game do I want to play? And you have the joy of the learning, even though you seem to get killed. You see the child's joy even when he goes into a shoot 'em up game of war. He kills, gets killed. Sometimes he starts the game and he gets killed and says, oh, that was a mistake. Let me get back in. That is closer. I'm not saying it's exactly the same. It's closer to the soul's joy of exploration. Okay? So it's not about teaching lessons. That's again a wrong idea that you have, which comes from mixture of the Abrahamic and the ascetic and other traditions. But you still make this speculation again. What if the goal is breeding us in this realm like cattle, wiping our memory after death and recycling us here to harvest our energies? Who has the power to wipe your memory if the soul is utterly free? Only you have the power to either wipe or choose to withhold rather than wipe, withhold, hold back. Nobody, even an asuric being incarnated in body or non-incarnate entity, can override the self's freedom. So this mentality and this prison planet phrase, I've seen it come in certain UFO literature where they'll say you are actually on a prison, etc. The truth of it, yes, there are asuric beings who would like to create trouble, who want to, and they feed on your energies of suffering or whatever emotions. They feed on it. There are vital beings who are leeching on you, so to say, all the time when you have these drama of emotions. And the latest book of Mark is dwelling on that quite a bit. But to say the whole planet is full of this, that's an error. We are not a prison planet. We are an evolutionary planet. People who choose to live as prisoners of their own, let's say, ignorance, that's a different game. Those who choose to grow out of it, it's your freedom. Yes, there are beings who will leech on you when you go through this. They will try to create more suffering for feeding on you. But you are free by action, by effort, to come out of that, to not participate in that and break free. And to the extent that you break free, they don't find you interesting, they move on to others. So I think largely this should answer your questions. I hope, just see in case there is a few questions around this. So Sandhya is asking, why are some souls more mature than others? Do all souls originate from the Supreme Brahman at the same time? No, in fact, what Sri Aurobindo says is there is constant release of, so to say, new sparks from the source. But it's a concept which is a little difficult for the human mind to comprehend, because a soul in coming into existence is an eternal being. And as an eternal being, it has always been, it will always be. So how did it come out? So depending on where you look, if you look from below, you will say all souls, all individuals have always been. We represent powers, aspects, or rays of the One Supreme, always being. But some have moved into manifestation, so to say, much more. Some have come onto our earth relatively more recently. Some are as if relatively young in their emergence from an animal grade of evolution or phase of evolution and coming into grade of mind, which is what we would call it a human grade of evolution. So yes, there are beings, there are souls which are still very young, less developed, and so on. I hope that answers the question. And I hope Pratik is fully satisfied. Let's go to the next.
From Piyush. This question of mine is a bit off topic, but it's on the psychic beings, so I thought I might as well ask it. I have been recently very interested in integral yoga, and I've watched your whole series of talks from number 78 to 90 multiple times, and I was very excited as I have found a way to reach the psychic being relatively faster and know it more intimately and bring it out in front through the practice given in Evenings with Sraddhalu 82. But I recently read from a compilation on the psychic being, Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, in which the Mother explicitly said it will take 30 years of sadhana to bring out the psychic being, which devastated me to my core. Will I really be able to only properly start the psychic sadhana after 30 years? Doesn't that defeat the whole purpose of speeding up the evolution as much as possible in this lifetime only? I have been very confused and devastated by this statement of the Mother. Can you please clarify this for me?
Yes, it's a very interesting question from Piyush, and I'm just going to play on this a little bit. Let's assume now Piyush is about 25 years old. Okay, just for purpose of argument, maybe you're older, but probably you're not too much younger. So let's say out of your 30 years, you've already used up 25 and you have only 5 years left. So if you follow your 30-year plan, then you're very close to it within 5 years. Just as a joke. No, I don't mean that. That's not the point. The point what Mother said is it takes 30 years of sadhana in the normal course of human evolution. So I'm going to read an actual quote from the Mother. This is from July 4th, 1956. Somebody asks about shooting star, and if you see a shooting star, your aspiration is fulfilled. Mother gives the example. She says it's not about the star. It's because in the short time you have, what can you formulate? And you can formulate only something which is very much in the front with a certain intensity. And because it's in the front with an intensity, that is likely to happen. So the shooting star is only a trigger to evoke what was already within you. So it's not the star which makes it happen. It's the fact that it was already in front. So it's likely to happen. So she says, if an aspiration can be formulated while the star is visible, this means it is all the time there, present, in the forefront of the consciousness. This doesn't apply to ordinary things. It has nothing to do with that. It concerns a spiritual aspiration. But the point is that if you are able to articulate your spiritual aspiration just at that moment, it means that it is right in front of your consciousness and it dominates your consciousness. And necessarily, what dominates your consciousness can be realized very swiftly. And then she says, I had the opportunity to make this experiment, exactly this. The moment the star was falling, at that very moment, they sprang up from the consciousness to realize the divine union for this body, that very moment. And before the end of the year, it was done. And it was not because of the star. It was because that dominated my whole consciousness. And I was thinking of nothing but that. I wanted nothing but that. Thought only of that. Acted only for that. And then she says, so this thing which generally takes a whole lifetime, it is said the minimum time is 35 years. Before 12 months, it was done. But that was because I thought only of that. Now I'm quoting exactly, so I've entered the quote here. So you see what she says very carefully. This thing which generally takes a whole lifetime, it is said a minimum time is 35 years. It is said. It's not Mother saying this is the case. Generally, people are spending an entire lifetime to get to a point where in late age they will say, yes, I've been there, done that. Now, what's the point of this life? Let me look for some deeper meaning and purpose. This is the common journey of most human beings. So we are speaking here of general humanity which does not have a clear conscious spiritual aspiration. In Mother's case, from the point she started this one-pointed pursuit, in 1 year, it was not just realization of the psychic being or the inner divine, it was the realization for her body's consciousness, which is a whole bigger thing. It took 1 year. And realizing the psychic, or let's forget the word realization, I'll say experience of the psychic first. A direct experience of the psychic can be had within a month, within a few days. It all depends on the state of concentration. An experience and a direct experience when you see it, feel it, know it as a thing in itself is one of the most beautiful experiences one can ever have in the incarnation. But that experience can be had in such a short time as much as this. So I would simply go back to your initial experience, initial thrill, the initial excitement that says, yes, now I found a way and I want this. Trust that you are not on the normal track where people are being led and wandering, drifting, and perhaps eventually getting to something useful or not. You are on a conscious track, and the time can be compressed. So there's another text. I couldn't find it just now using keyword searches. But the mother says in the ashram, in the context of the ashram, she says, here there is a certain condensation of the presence, which makes it possible that that thing which would take 30 years normally can be achieved in 9 months. If I remember right, she says 9 months. It's interesting why she uses 9 months. But the point is, without too much effort, you would do it in 9 months. If you did some effort, you could do it in much shorter time. For the mother to give that experience was as simple as this, even as an experience. Of course, she didn't do it to all because not always all were even ready. But to those who were ready, in the very meeting, she would go deep, deep, deep within, all the way to the psychic presence and draw it out just like that. And suddenly your whole inner being was like this in front. And you'd feel so wonderful, but because you didn't care, you were not conscious of what it meant, you were not able to hold or contain, or were not perhaps even interested in it. I'm feeling so great. That's all you are at. She said in most cases, by the time they went down the stairs and reached the bottom, they had already gone back to their normal state of consciousness. So a lot of the time needed for getting to that experience is the preparatory phase in which when you get it, you're able to then retain the imprint of it and not just lose it within a few minutes. Quite a large part is a preparatory phase. And that's one of habituating yourself with that presence, building the continuity of consciousness. I've even known of cases where people went deep enough, or they were led deep enough, had the vivid experience, were overwhelmed by it, and they came out, and then very rapidly the memory of it began to fade, and sometimes it was totally gone. Or within a few days it faded. And it's quite fascinating to see how that happens. And it's only because the continuity has not been built, the preparation of receptivity in the outer layers was not done. For which is the discipline, I think perhaps it is discussed also in the evenings series number 82 and a few talks before and after, the cultivation of your normal surface ranges of consciousness and building the sensitivity to the deeper inner and to the psychic presence, and the overall aligning of all your thoughts, feelings and actions around that central aspiration. That's the basic cultivation. So that when the experience does come, it is able to be held, retained, even at least in the memory, and even as an influence, it can be strong enough. So please cling to that excitation or joy and hope and aspiration, and the deeper word, I will say, the faith. In hearing, in reading, it awakened the faith that yes, this is within reach, this is what I can do, and I want. Cling to that. When you read the mother, or when you find in Sri Aurobindo, you feel something which is disappointing or sounds difficult, look at the context. Be very careful about the wording. When they say something, there's a very specific context to it. In this case, she says, it is said generally in the normal life, etc. You're not in that. So it doesn't apply to you. You are precisely in the process where it can be achieved very quickly. So I hope this clarifies. We'll go to the last question.
From Mira, is there a way for a soul to intentionally aspire to be born as a positive world leader like Elon Musk or Modi ji or Trump? Or are they vibhutis specially born to implement Divine Mother's agenda?
It's an interesting question. So it's not as if a soul can say, hey, I'm going to become a world leader. It can choose a life of leadership, or the experience of leadership, where it wants to build or work with, build an empire or work to impact a group, a collective, and so on. But not all have the necessary means to be able to do that. Not always have the maturity or the powers which have been developed to be able to do that. So let's say, even if you look at the ability to influence with a strong vital. Now, you can be born in a family where there's a strong vital. It's not a big deal. I've seen many leaders of industry in business, and I had occasion. Someday I hope I can share some of my experiences in these directions without worrying about compromising personal things. But it's a topic which is more personal and sharing of a more autobiographical nature. But I had occasion to meet some of the elites of India's industry, CEOs, managing directors of the 30, 40 biggest companies of India, in conferences multiple times, and have personal interaction with some of them. What I saw, because I'm seeing now not when they're seated in their chair, but as human beings in a relaxed space, what I saw was many of them were very unrefined, very coarse and crude. Not all, but many were like this. They were sitting on a chair where they headed an entire empire, a business empire, where a decision they took could impact massively things. They had tremendous, in the coarseness, a tremendous hold on the coarse power of the vital. Not even saying it was refined, some of them. There were others who were refined, and they wielded that effectively, but they could. That the ability to wield the power, much of it was perhaps hereditary. And I said to myself, if this man can do this, what if there was a more refined, developed person wielding that same force? Imagine how much could be done. But what I found generally was, when people were more refined, they struggled to wield the vitality. And very few that I've found who have the ability to wield largely the vital energy and still hold their refinement and exercise the power. So this is where I'm saying the maturity of the soul's evolution and its capacity to wield the vital energies would be developed across lives, perhaps. And then if you have that, and you may choose to incarnate for that purpose of impacting largely the collective circumstances for a mission, so to say, you could incarnate for that with that activation of the vital. But then in the development of your personality, you would go through all the difficulties which come with a strong vital, including a rebellious nature, which includes the rebellion the vital will have to its own innate divinity or to the divine will, and all those problems which you have to pass through. And you'll overcome, perhaps because you already worked on it in prior lives, so you would overcome more easily, but you'll still pass through those, briefly at least, in wielding this new material of the vital. Unless you've built that, carried over and infused it, then you would have perhaps less difficulty. So all of these are possibilities. But it's not as if you can say, now I'm going to become prime minister or president and wield the power on that scale. That's not in your hands. To be able to wield it in a collective way, yes, that could be your choice. What is the collective? How you navigate in the power structures and get to what position? A lot of it would depend on your skill, capacity and opportunities of that moment. Some people you can see and say, this person will go really, really far. I had this brief interaction with name slips my mind. Lina, if you can recall the Hawaiian lady. So I have speaking of who's now heading in the Trump administration, significant position. Tulsi Gabbard, sorry. The name just blocked out. Okay. So Tulsi Gabbard, I had occasion to interact with her briefly. We were in the same platform for a program. I had brief interaction, but what I saw in her was a tremendous vitality, but a tremendous purity, and an ability to be transparent to a higher purpose and live for it and act through this powerful vital. And it was not chaotic, it was trained, she was wielding it, holding it. And I said, wow, this woman will go very far. And I'm going to share this, put it on record if you like. She had the potential to become US president someday. Whether it happens, no, she has capacity to. Whether it happens, to be seen. Had she been born 50 years ago, it would not be possible. Today, because of the shift that has taken place with Trump's coming to power the second time, it actually is likely at some point that she may get that chance, because today she is in a position where she can demonstrate her leadership potential and learn to wield it despite opposition, and powerful opposition that she has not yet had experience in this lifetime. She will face it now, and she will be able to overcome. She has the capacity. But there will be a learning, there will be a training, learning the ropes of the political game. And hopefully, in the coming, let's say, decade, the politics in the United States would be sufficiently cleaned out that someone like her would then be given a chance to wield without needing to struggle with this otherwise circumstances of a compromised system. And it might still happen. But will it happen? Can't say. That's where you have the gamble of the play. Will she impact people? Will she be a good leader? Very likely, because she has that capacity and the purity of purpose. And this, I can say this, when I remember that, I was so amazed, I was so impressed, but I was so happy. I said, wow, such people are there in the politics. And it was then interesting to see, because at that point she was still in the Democratic Party. Then she resigned from it. She spoke there, she spoke her mind, and she spoke purposefully for the good of the United States, for nation, but also good of humanity, against wars. And at some point she had to leave the party because it was not aligning with the party ideology, and then she then joins Trump. So yes, it can happen. Will it? Can't say. So it's not as if you can say, I'm going to become a world leader. It's more like, will you exercise the power to impact events? Yes, you could. And then when you have used this phrase of vibhuti, so there are two kinds of vibhutis. There are those where emerging from below, they are aligned to an ideal, and from above, something of the divine power then uses that alignment to connect to you and work through you. Such a person is vibhuti. In that sense, at least because they are open to the spiritual and consciously open, Narendra Modi is incarnating as a vibhuti a certain aspect. But he's an evolutionary being. He's not born just for that. He's an evolutionary being now aligned to a divine, let's say, purpose, which uses him consciously as an instrument, and he's conscious of it. This is very clear. So yes, this can happen. But the other type of vibhuti is one where the origin itself is directly from the divine, like a ray put out, does the work, finishes, and withdraws. And then they are not in that sense evolutionary in a conventional sense that they are incarnating and growing through. They're two different kinds. So very few people who come in that way. They're very rare. They come when there's a major intervention required. But more often than not, there's an alignment from above using a vehicle, lifting the vehicle to a height, and in that sense you become partial vibhuti, let's say. And yes, that's possible. You could, and I would say you don't need a very strong vital for that. You, each one of you, each one, all of us, can and should aspire to become a conscious instrument for the divine consciousness. Within the vehicle and capacity given to you, in the domain and direction given to you, within the space that is open to you, become a conscious instrument. To that extent, we could still use the word vibhuti. And the Bhagavad Gita actually uses that phrase. There's a chapter which is called the Vibhuti Yoga, which speaks of this, that you become the vehicle. Incarnation would be, I see it's all a question of how you utilize these words. You incarnate the divine will through and in the vehicle that you are, in the opportunities open to you. And sometimes, when that happens, the divine will use you in ways that you could never have imagined. And because it is a divine action using you despite your limitations, it can even open opportunities through which something is done, and the work done, maybe that opportunity is no more needed, and your life goes in whatever direction it was. There are people, occasionally, in moments are lifted. The action takes place, withdraws, does, and then you move on. And you of course, receive the benefit of that action working through you. You are lifted, you are grown, your evolution is accelerated, and so on. But if you use the word vibhuti or not is irrelevant. I would simply say the principle of the vibhuti is genuinely true for each one of us. And all of us should aspire to become conscious vehicles for the divine influence, will, action more and more directly. In us and through us, these two distinctions. In us directly to act to change us, to lift us, to transform us. Through us to act on circumstances, to lift the circumstances and change things. I'm going to briefly look at the chat box for the last few, if there's anything. So, Vaijayanti is saying, despite belonging to the traditional yoga of ascetic life, how come Yogi Adityanath is able to perform with such intensity and have such an impact? So, he wears ochre robes. He is part of a lineage or part of a system where he is an ascetic. But understand, there are two kinds of ascetics today. Even if you take in the Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama himself technically should be an ascetic as a monk, own nothing, etc. But he rides a luxury car and owns gigantic properties and wealth, part of the lineage as a political head, at least, if nothing else, isn't it? So the ascetics are two kinds. Those are life shunning, life denying, and withdrawing totally. And then there are those who are ascetic in the external, let's say, process and form, including wearing the ochre robes, but who are choosing to engage with life. And sometimes these are the most effective, because on some level, if they've been truly in the ascetic purpose, they've shunned personal interest, personal ownership, but aligned consciously to collective purpose and divine purpose. To the extent they have been able to do that, irrespective of how pure they are as an instrument, to the extent that they align to a higher purpose and more selfless, the divine force will and you can use them to impact far more than their individual capacity. So it's not like he was a great administrator to begin with, but he was built, he grew, he learned from mistakes. And as long as he holds the purity of his intention and conscious opening to receive a higher influence or guidance, he will be used effectively. It does not matter what the belief system is or what lineage or tradition or ascetic mechanism he is part of. The fact that he chooses to engage with life from that position. Doesn't matter what clothes he wears. Narendra Modi is another example. He's not wearing ochre robes, but he lives the life of a monk practically, owning nothing practically, again, and no personal interest. Everything is life dedicated selflessly to service for the nation. In this very aspiration and intention, he opens himself to a higher action of the Divine Mother's consciousness, of Bharat Mata, Mother India, to act and work through him to the extent he can hold that purity. And there will be not points of, let's say, limitations or incapacities or blockages of various kinds from past training, which will hinder and to that extent limit the effectivity. Yet, and this is the beauty of the divine working, it will use those weaknesses also sometimes to act in a way that is greater than what you could have done. So it does not matter what term you use, whether you're ascetic or not. It's your choice to engage. The technically correct ascetic would have said, oh, this is the world of illusion. I have nothing to do with it. Why should I even engage politically? I withdraw. So such a person would be useless for purpose of changing the world circumstance. They may still serve by holding a higher consciousness or not. That's a different story. So it does not matter. And you don't have to be an ascetic, nor do you need to not be an ascetic. It's the way you relate to the world and the way you choose to be an instrument. All the rest are external images. So Madhuri asks, we are incarnations of the divine will, but what prevents us from being used as her tool? Good question. Your choice. When you choose to consciously align to the divine will, you are available for the divine action. When you're busy, lost in your normal life impulses, pattern of desires, interests, habits, etc., lost in the play itself without being conscious of the divine and without a conscious aspiration to open to and become an instrument for the divine action, then you are not a conscious instrument. Nevertheless, you are an instrument. Everyone is an instrument. Even the asura is an instrument. Even though Asura chooses to oppose the divine will, the divine, because is always whole, is greater than even these narrow pieces. The divine will use that opposition to accelerate even the evolution in some way or other. But of course, there'll be suffering and other consequences. So, in a sense, all that exists, being part of the divine, is used to fulfill the divine will, but indirectly. The difference is whether the will is fulfilled indirectly and therefore slowly and through much struggle and suffering, or is it fulfilled directly, rapidly, through joy and through growth in light rather than struggle in darkness. And that's the difference we make by choosing to become conscious. So, first step, become conscious of yourself and learn to organize and center your thoughts, emotions, actions, and will around some deeper and higher center of yourself. If there has not been this integration, even if there is a divine afflatus, from what focal point will it act in you? Where there is no focal point. If you are disparate, broken pieces, it cannot act effectively. So first integrate around a center, even if it's mind or if it's the heart aspiration, whatever form it takes, a center around which you organize overall your thoughts, emotions, actions. If you're not organized and if you're in two fragments, the will acting on one level, the other fragment will be open to the contrary wills, and you will not be an effective instrument, or you'll be a damaged, self-contradicting instrument. Those are most dangerous. Because partial light and partial darkness, often the light will withdraw because it will not allow itself to be associated with the darkness. So be very careful. The point first is organize around a central focus. Then, from that central focus, you turn to becoming conscious of the divine presence within you, above you, in whatever way is most easy for you. And as you become conscious of it, feel it more and try to feel all your actions in alignment with it, or let the initiation of all your actions be more and more aligned to that feel. So when you have a thought, when you have an intention, or when you have an action you're going to take, step back, lean into that presence, feel from there, what does this feel like? Sometimes in the very act of being in it, the nature of what you're about to do changes immediately. And as you do it, it is of a different quality or even of a different direction. But you will feel in that, this feels right, or no, this is not right. What is right will flow from you. Then flow with it. So more and more you make a conscious initiation of action from that. Then next stage, when you're flowing, sometimes there'll be mixes and distortions. That's okay. Don't worry. Be conscious and observe. At what point do you lose alignment? So when I exercise power, beyond a certain point, when the power intensifies, it tends to get clouded and mixed. Notice, observe that point, pause there. And again, align more and more. And you'll build your capacity to exercise power, for example, in alignment with the divine presence. The same with consciousness. When you move from knowledge to action, you have a mixture. Observe the point, make the correction. So bit by bit, you are also lifted, and the consciousness works through you to help you grow. But starting point, you must have an individualized focus, preferably in your deepest and highest accessible poise center. From there, becoming conscious of the presence, and then using that as the reference more and more as you grow. So such would be the steps by which all of us should and will become more and more conscious instruments for the divine working in the world. So we have covered here a variety of very important questions. There are many more interesting questions also waiting. Today we have not touched the text itself. So the next time we will continue with the text, but also take up a whole set of other related questions regarding incarnation. The theme itself is quite fascinating, and as we can see, it opens so many different aspects for our understanding, but also has deep implications for our life purpose. So let's take a moment to hold in aspiration our sense of purpose, to become conscious instruments for the divine will more and more. And with that, earth will not seem to be anymore like a prison. More and more it will be unveiled domain of divine manifestation, and a domain where something can be manifested which is so beautiful and so wonderful that even among other planets, they will say, ah, yes, that's a good example for us, isn't it? Such should be the beauty of our Earth evolution. But for that, we take our first step, for each one of us to become at least to some degree conscious vehicles for that.